Inside Texas Supermax, life on death row at Palunsky. There is a place in East Texas where time doesn't pass the way it does everywhere else. From the outside, it looks like any other prison: concrete walls, security towers, perimeter fencing. But inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, time stretches. It slows. It presses down on the men who live there. Because this is where Texas keeps those sentenced to die. Not for days. Not for months. But for years. Sometimes decades. And the most unsettling part is not the execution itself. It's the waiting. Inside these walls, death is not sudden. It's scheduled. Anticipated. Revisited every single day. And for the men inside, the question is no longer if it will happen, but how long they can endure before it does. What happens behind these walls is rarely seen in full. And what unfolds over time is far more complex than most imagine. Before the gates open, take a moment to follow this journey closely and reflect on where this story is reaching you from. The distance between this place and the outside world is not just physical, it's psychological. The arrival, crossing into a different world. The journey to Palunsky is designed to be controlled from the very beginning. Inmates sentenced to death are transported in secure vehicles, often after sentencing or transfer from another unit. They are restrained at multiple points: wrists cuffed, waist shackled, ankles bound. Movement is limited to inches. Conversation is minimal. Guards rarely speak unless necessary. The environment is quiet, except for the sound of metal restraints shifting with the motion of the vehicle. For some, this is the first moment they fully understand where they are going. Courtrooms are distant. Appeals feel abstract. But this is real. The road narrows as it approaches Livingston, Texas. Trees close in on both sides. Civilization fades. Then the facility appears. High walls. Reinforced fencing. Watchtowers positioned with precision. No grand entrance. No sense of arrival. Just a gate. And once that gate closes behind the transport vehicle, the transition is complete. Inside intake, the process begins immediately. Clothing is removed. Personal belongings are taken. Identity is reduced to documentation and classification. Fingerprints. Photographs. Medical checks. Every step is procedural. But beneath that procedure is a quiet understanding: this is not a temporary stay. This is where they will remain, until the end. And once assigned a cell, the final door closes with a sound that echoes longer than expected. Because it's not just a door. It's a boundary between two completely different versions of reality. The cell, a world reduced to concrete and steel. The cell is where everything happens. And where nothing changes. Each inmate is housed alone. The space is small, approximately 60 square feet. Concrete walls on all sides. A solid steel door with no bars. Just a narrow slot for food trays and restraints. There is no open interaction. No shared airspace. No physical contact. Inside, the furnishings are minimal. A concrete slab serves as a bed, topped with a thin mattress. A combined sink and toilet unit is fixed to the wall. There may be a small desk surface, depending on the cell. And then, there is the light. It never fully disappears. Even at night, illumination remains. Dim, but constant. Sleep becomes irregular. Time becomes unclear. The window offers little relief. Frosted or narrow, it limits visibility to fragments: a portion of sky, a wall, sometimes nothing at all. The purpose is not comfort. It is control. But what begins as physical restriction slowly evolves into something deeper. Because over time, the cell doesn't just contain the body. It begins to shape the mind. And the longer someone remains inside, the more difficult it becomes to separate thought from environment. Some inmates adapt. Others struggle. And some begin to deteriorate in ways that are not immediately visible. The daily routine, repetition without relief. The day begins early, though morning is more of a schedule than a feeling. Breakfast arrives through the slot. There is no announcement beyond the sound of metal against metal. The tray slides in. The door remains closed. There is no conversation. Lunch follows hours later. Then dinner. Each meal is structured, measured, consistent. Not necessarily for nutrition alone, but for order. Between meals, time stretches. Some inmates read. Books become essential, one of the few tools available to occupy the mind. Others write letters. Pages filled slowly, carefully, often rewritten multiple times. Because communication is limited, every word carries weight. Recreation is offered, but it is solitary. 1 hour per day, if permitted. The inmate is escorted, restrained, to an outdoor enclosure. High walls. A metal grate overhead. No direct view of the outside world. It is movement, but not freedom. Showers are scheduled separately. Also controlled. Also monitored. Everything follows a pattern. And at first, that pattern may feel manageable. But over time, repetition becomes something else. It removes variation. It removes anticipation. And without those elements, time begins to lose meaning. Days blend together. Weeks become indistinguishable. And the question arises quietly, persistently, how long can a person exist without change? The sound of isolation, when silence is never complete. True silence does not exist inside Palunsky. But neither does true connection. Instead, there is something in between. Voices travel through vents, under doors, along concrete walls. Inmates call out to each other, not always to communicate, but to confirm presence. To remind themselves they are not completely alone. Some develop routines around this. Scheduled conversations shouted across the tier. Shared phrases. Familiar voices. But distance distorts everything. Words echo. Tone disappears. Meaning shifts. And over time, even these fragile connections begin to fade. Because isolation changes how people interact. Some withdraw completely. Days pass without a word. Others become louder. More frequent. Almost desperate to be heard. And then there are those who begin speaking, but no longer to anyone in particular. Long monologues. Repeated phrases. Moments that suggest the line between internal and external thought is beginning to blur. This is one of the least visible effects of long-term isolation. It doesn't happen suddenly. It builds slowly. And by the time it's noticeable, it's already deeply rooted. Power and control, structure in a place without movement. Even in a place defined by isolation, structure exists. Not in the form of physical dominance, but through control of environment. Correctional officers maintain strict authority over every aspect of daily life. Movement is scheduled. Access is regulated. Behavior is monitored. Consistency is critical. Because in an environment where individuals have very little left to lose, unpredictability can create risk. Some officers operate with quiet professionalism, keeping distance, maintaining order. Others enforce rules more aggressively. But regardless of style, the system itself remains unchanged. Every decision passes through protocol. And inmates quickly learn that even small actions, timing, tone, compliance, can affect their conditions. Privileges, limited as they are, can be restricted. Recreation removed. Property reduced. And when discipline is applied, it is immediate. But what happens when discipline meets someone who no longer fears consequences? That tension, between control and resistance, is always present. Even when nothing appears to be happening. The passage of time, waiting without end. Time inside Palunsky is not just slow. It's heavy. Some inmates arrive in their 20s or 30s. And remain there for decades. Appeals are filed. Reviewed. Denied. Filed again. Legal processes extend the timeline, but do not erase the sentence. And so the waiting continues. Years pass. The outside world evolves, technology, culture, entire generations. But inside the unit, very little changes. The same walls. The same routines. The same limits. This creates a unique psychological condition. A life that continues, but without progression. No milestones. No movement forward. Just duration. And over time, the future becomes less important than the immediate moment. Because thinking too far ahead becomes overwhelming. And thinking too far back becomes painful. So many focus on the present. On the next meal. The next letter. The next hour. Until even those small markers begin to feel indistinct. Final days, when time becomes precise. At some point, for certain inmates, the waiting ends. An execution date is set. And everything shifts. The inmate is informed. Legal teams are notified. Procedures begin. The timeline, once uncertain, becomes exact. Days are counted. Final visits are scheduled. Last statements prepared. The environment changes subtly. More movement. More supervision. But also, more focus. Because this is the final phase of a process that may have lasted decades. And for the individual at the center of it, time behaves differently once again. Not stretched. Not blurred. But sharply defined. Every hour matters. And every moment carries weight. The final walk, a controlled end. The walk is structured. Measured. There is no deviation. Escorted by officers, the inmate moves through controlled space toward the execution chamber. Everything is procedural. Every step anticipated. But beneath that procedure is something more difficult to define. Because this is the only moment in Palunsky where the end is no longer theoretical. It is immediate. And while the system maintains control, the reality of the moment is unmistakable. This is the conclusion of a long process. One that began years, sometimes decades, earlier. And once it begins, it does not stop. Aftermath, return to routine. Afterward, the unit returns to its normal operations. Meals continue. Doors remain closed. Schedules are followed. But something lingers. Because even in a place built around death, its presence is never fully neutral. For staff, it is part of the job. For inmates, it is a reminder. And for the facility itself, it is a function. But beneath all of that, it is still an ending. And endings leave impressions. Even in silence. The Allan B. Palunsky Unit does not rely on chaos to maintain control. It relies on consistency. Isolation. Time. For the men inside, life is no longer defined by freedom or movement, but by endurance. Endurance of space. Endurance of silence. Endurance of waiting. And perhaps the most difficult question remains unanswered: what does it mean to exist for years, knowing exactly how your story will end? Inside these walls, that question is not theoretical. It is lived. Every day. Until there are no more days left to count. The invisible weight, what isolation does over time. There is no single moment when isolation begins to change a person. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds, quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Days pass in repetition. Weeks follow without variation. Months begin to fold into each other. And somewhere along that timeline, something shifts. Inside the Allan B. Palunsky Unit, the absence of human contact becomes more than a condition. It becomes a force. In environments like this, the mind begins to compensate. Some inmates create rigid routines, waking at the same time, pacing the same number of steps, organizing their limited belongings in precise order. Structure becomes a way to resist disorientation. Others turn inward. Memory becomes a refuge. They replay conversations from years earlier, reconstruct familiar places in detail, hold on to voices that no longer exist in their daily reality. But memory is unpredictable. It doesn't always comfort. Sometimes it distorts. And when there is nothing external to anchor thought, the internal world begins to expand. For some, that expansion becomes overwhelming. There are documented cases of inmates experiencing anxiety, depression, and deep withdrawal. Others report difficulty concentrating, or a growing inability to distinguish between past and present. What makes this environment particularly difficult is that it does not offer interruption. There are no meaningful changes in setting. No spontaneous interactions. No variation strong enough to reset the mind. And over years, sometimes decades, that uninterrupted isolation leaves a mark. Not always visible, but rarely reversible. What happens next is not about punishment alone. It's about endurance under conditions that were never meant to be temporary. Connections that fade, family, distance, and time. At the beginning of a death row sentence, contact with the outside world still feels possible. Letters arrive. Visits are scheduled. There is a sense, however fragile, that connection remains. But distance is not just physical. It is measured in time. Years pass, and the outside world continues to move forward. Families grow older. Children become adults. Relationships shift, sometimes quietly, sometimes completely. Maintaining contact becomes harder. Travel to the facility requires time, money, and emotional strength. Not every family can sustain that. And for those inside, each missed visit carries weight. Each delayed letter becomes noticeable. Over time, communication often slows. Not always out of neglect, but out of life continuing elsewhere. Inside the cell, this creates another form of isolation. Because while the physical environment remains unchanged, the emotional connections that once extended beyond it begin to weaken. Some inmates continue writing regularly, even without response. Others stop. Not because they no longer care, but because the absence becomes too difficult to confront. In this way, the sentence extends beyond the individual. It reaches outward. And gradually, the world on the outside becomes less immediate and more distant. Faith, reflection, and personal change. In a place where time is abundant but opportunity is limited, many turn to reflection. For some, that reflection leads to faith. Religious texts become central, read repeatedly, studied carefully, sometimes memorized. Prayer offers structure. It offers meaning within an environment that provides very little of it. For others, reflection takes a different form. Writing becomes a way to process time. Journals fill with thoughts, questions, regrets. Letters become more than communication, they become a record of change. Because even in isolation, people continue to evolve. They reconsider past decisions. Revisit moments that led them here. Try to understand not just what happened, but why. This process is not uniform. Some find clarity. Others struggle to reach it. But what remains consistent is the presence of time, uninterrupted, unavoidable time, to think. And with that time comes something difficult to measure. Personal transformation. The challenge, however, is that within this system, change does not alter outcome. No matter how much reflection occurs, no matter how much growth takes place, the sentence remains. And that reality creates a tension that is difficult to resolve. Because it raises a quiet question: what is the purpose of change, in a place where the end cannot be changed? Staff on the other side, routine, responsibility, and distance. The experience of Palunsky is not limited to those inside the cells. It extends to those who work there. Correctional officers operate within a structured system designed to maintain order at all times. Their responsibilities are clear: security, supervision, enforcement. But the environment they work in is unlike most others. They walk the same tiers daily, pass the same doors, hear the same voices. Over time, familiarity develops. Not in the form of friendship, but recognition. They learn names, patterns, behaviors. And while professional boundaries remain, the human element is never entirely removed. Maintaining that balance is part of the job. Too much distance can create tension. Too much familiarity can create risk. So most operate somewhere in between, focused, consistent, controlled. But there are moments that challenge that balance. Moments when routine intersects with reality. And those moments stay with people. Even after the shift ends. Even after they leave the facility. Because while the structure of the job remains constant, the weight of what it represents does not disappear easily. The system behind the walls, law, delay, and final decisions. Behind every inmate at Palunsky is a legal process that continues long after sentencing. Appeals move through multiple levels of review. State courts. Federal courts. Legal arguments revisited, examined, challenged. This process can take years. Sometimes decades. It is designed to ensure that every case is examined thoroughly. But for the individuals waiting inside the unit, it introduces another layer of uncertainty. Because each appeal represents both possibility and delay, hope and extension. And when appeals are denied, the process moves forward. Execution dates are set. Final reviews take place. And eventually, decisions become final. This legal structure exists outside the prison walls, but its impact is felt deeply inside them. Because it shapes the timeline. It determines how long the waiting continues. And ultimately, it defines when that waiting ends. Silence after midnight, when everything stops moving. There is a point each night when movement inside Palunsky nearly stops. Doors remain closed. Lights dim slightly. Sound becomes minimal. But this is not rest in the traditional sense. Because sleep is not guaranteed here. For some, nighttime is the most difficult part of the day. Without distractions, thoughts become louder. Memories return more vividly. The awareness of time, of waiting, becomes sharper. Some inmates stay awake for hours. Others fall into short, fragmented sleep. And in that quiet, the environment feels even more contained. Because there is nothing to break the stillness. No change in scenery. No shift in pace. Just the steady presence of the cell. And the understanding that when morning comes, everything will repeat. Exactly as it did before. A system designed to end, and what it leaves behind. The Allan B. Polunsky Unit operates with precision. It is structured. Controlled. Consistent. Every aspect of it serves a purpose. To contain. To isolate. And ultimately, to carry out a sentence that cannot be reversed. But beyond that structure, there is something more difficult to define. A human experience shaped by time, confinement, and certainty. For the men inside, life becomes a series of moments, measured not by progress, but by endurance. For those who work there, it becomes a profession that requires balance between duty and distance. And for those observing from the outside, it raises questions that do not have simple answers. About justice. About punishment. About the cost of waiting. Because inside Palunsky, the story is not just about how life ends. It is about what happens in the years before it does. And that part of the story, quiet, repetitive, and often unseen, is where the true weight of this place exists. Long before the final moment arrives. And long after it's gone. What you've seen here is not just a system, it's a reality shaped by time, isolation, and consequence. Inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, every day follows the same pattern, but the weight of each moment is different. And long after the final door closes, the questions remain. Wherever you're watching from, share your thoughts below. And if you want to continue exploring stories like this, stories that reveal what exists beyond the surface, stay with us.